We are NWSOFA, which stands for Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. We're an indivisible chapter. We're one of 6,500 indivisible chapters across the country. We were started about 12 years ago, right after Barack Obama won his second term in 2012. We didn't quite know what we were going to be. We just were a bunch of folks that were making calls together every Tuesday and Thursday night. Shortly after that, Michelle and Barack Obama organized Organizing for Action using their OFA logos, and we became one of the first chapters there. And then 5 years later, after Indivisible started up, we became an indivisible chapter. So quite a group. We started out with 17 members. Today we have 5,500 just in a very tight area in the northwest suburbs, the land beyond O'Hare in the Chicagoland area. In the background, which I know you can't quite see, is our Snowflake organization principle. We have 10 different issue teams, which are managed by 24 all volunteers. Tonight we have David Doney and Karl Faulstich, who have been doing the fiscal for probably the last 8 to 10 years. They do it every month, and they provide necessary information for all of us, and actually information that all voters should have. So it's really, really cool. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Karl.
Hey, welcome everybody. Karl Faulstich here. David and I put together this presentation, mostly David. Again, this is the October meeting of the Fiscal and Economic Issues Discussion Group, where we're trying to give you information that allows you to communicate to your friends, your audience, the letters to the editor, the comments in a newspaper column, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got the last month in September, the U.S. added 254,000 jobs, and prior months were revised up by 72,000. We continue to see a nice increase in jobs. This was the peak under Trump back in February of 2020. Then we lost 22 million jobs in 2 months. And then we were recovering. There was a slight hiccup right at the end of Trump's terms where we lost about 240,000 jobs. But then once Biden took office, we started adding jobs at a good pace again. Back in June of 22, we got to where we were at the pre-pandemic peak, and then we've been adding jobs since then. And this just breaks it out to show that jobs and then 3-month average of jobs to take out some of the spikes. And this is no matter how you slice it, job creation is faster under Biden than under Trump. In Obama's second term, it was 216,000 jobs per month. Pre-pandemic, under Trump, it was 180,000. Overall, under Trump, we lost jobs, about 2.7 million. And then Biden, from inauguration, we had a big jump because we were gaining back jobs that had been lost. But even once we got to the June, July 22, we've been adding jobs at a really good pace since then. And this is actually, might be new this month, but it's certainly one of my favorite graphs that since 1989, since the end of Reagan's term, the U.S. has added 51 million jobs, and 50 million were created under a Democratic president. So you see fairly low job growth under George W. Bush, especially because of the Great Recession, mediocre job growth under George H.W. Bush, and net losses under Trump versus very strong growth under the 3 Democratic presidents. And this is David playing, and we'll let him come back to this at some point.
I can explain it. I mean, it's even if you give Trump credit and you don't penalize him for the pandemic, so you pretend that he had added 6.6 million jobs, you still also have to, if you're going to use that kind of logic, then you also have to penalize Bush 43 for that first year under Obama when the jobs were still falling. You know, Obama inherited an economy that was losing 700,000 or 800,000 a month. And so if you don't penalize Obama for that first year, you get a situation like this where it's more like, instead of being 50-1 or 51-1, it's more like 46-6. So it really doesn't change the math. the storyline, which is that the job creation happens under the Democrats for the most part.
And this is the unemployment rates. The U3 unemployment rate is the rate that gets reported generally every month. It's people who have been looking for work in the prior month, prior 4 weeks, that have not worked at all in the prior 4 weeks. And that's the U3 rate. It reached a low of 3.5 under Trump. It reached a low of 3.4 under Biden. It was actually 4.7% when Trump took office and 6.4% when he left office. So it went up substantially while he was in office. It went down and then up. And then under Biden, it's coming down, although it had reached a lower point of 3.4%, and it's now 4.1% in the most recent month. The U6 rate is a slightly broader rate measure of unemployment because it includes people who haven't worked in the prior month and not just have looked in the prior month, but have looked in the prior year. And it also includes people who have worked in the prior month part-time but want full-time employment. So there's about 4 to 5 million people that fall into that latter category. And that's why the U6 rate is and always will be higher than the U3 rate. Unemployment rates average for the year, we see that they were coming down under Trump until 2020 in the pandemic, and that did not get well managed. And we actually had the unemployment rate spike at one point up to around 15% before it came back down. And by January of 2021, it was 6.4%. And then under Biden, it's been continued to come down, and it's been relatively low for the last 3 years. And this is just mechanically how the unemployment rate is calculated. You basically have the civilian labor force and the population, the people who are working and or looking for work, the labor force, the people who are actually employed, and the unemployed divided by the labor force is the unemployment rate. And this is perhaps a little bit better measure of things than the unemployment rate. It's the employment to population ratio. It's the percent of people in prime working age, 25 to 54. So they're older than students and generally before retiring, percentage of them that are actually working. By the way, if you ever look at all the folks that talk about the high unemployment rate in Illinois, it's because we have high workforce participation, because our employment population ratio is higher than the national average and higher than most of our neighbors. Job openings to the unemployment level. At this point, we have a few more job openings than we have number of unemployed, which creates a ratio of just over 1, which is not a bad job market, not what it was a few years back when people were, jumping jobs and getting huge raises, but it's still a pretty decent job market. And our Republican friends like to talk about how all the jobs today are part-time or government or, everybody has to have 3 jobs and, people are laid off, et cetera. So this just goes to, okay, part-time and as a percentage of the people who are employed, and this was pre-pandemic in 2023 and 2024, it was 17%. So pretty much the same. A slightly smaller percentage of the jobs are government jobs than back in 2019. That may have been the start of census stuff, which is primarily in 2020, but there's a little bit of work done on the census in the year before. Percentage of people that are multiple job holders is pretty much the same, and it's like 1 in 20 people. And layoffs are not a big, huge factor. Glenn, feel free to speak up.
Yeah. Question. The ones that are not looking for work in the U6 category, that are working part-time but yet want to work full-time, what obstacles are they finding to put them in that hurdle?
A variety of things, actually. Sometimes the companies that they're working for had a lower number of orders. Therefore, They cut everybody back to part-time for a little bit. Otherwise, I'm trying to think what are some of the other reasons that people work part-time when they want to work full-time. Because remember, there's about 25 to 30 million people that are working part-time, and over 21 million people want to work part-time. So most of the people who are working part-time want to work part-time because they're parents, there's, part-time retirees, kind of people like that. David, do you have any other thoughts on why people are forced to work part-time?
It's a really good question. I don't have a good answer. I would say the demand is not there for their services, clearly, or they would be expanding those hours. It's a sign that maybe corporations are being a little more cautious, but I'd have to research that to give you a better answer. I don't have one.
Okay, thank you.
One factor might be that companies do not have to pay as much in benefits if someone is part-time as they do if they are full-time.
That's true. If people are working more than 30 hours, they're entitled to healthcare benefits and others.
Yeah, there's an article here on Morningstar. I was just looking at it. It's saying full-time jobs are vanishing and forcing more people into part-time work. So it has to do with that cooling labor market. The source that, Karl, could you go back a couple to the ratio with the open jobs? That ratio, that blue line on the far right there, coming down from 2 down to below, toward 1, is probably at the core of this, is that corporations just aren't hiring the full-time roles that they used to. But I'll have to, as we go through the break, I'll take a look at this article, but it's in Morningstar. Full-time jobs are vanishing and forcing more people to work. I'll drop it in the chat.
Thanks.
Okay, so now we're going to look.
Curious to see what they say.
Now we're going to look at household financial positions. What are household net worths? And what we see, and this is increase in economic measures, so not absolute. The net worth of the bottom 50% from the fourth quarter of 2019 pre-pandemic to the second quarter, which is the most recent data. The third quarter just ended, but the data has not yet been reported. So net worth was up almost 100% for the people at the bottom. Stocks are up 70%. For people in the 50th to 90th percentile group, their net worth is up 52%. GDP is up 32%. Home prices are up 26%. Hourly wages are up 26%. And inflation is up 21%. So wages are up a little bit more than inflation, sort of keeping up with home prices, except that interest rates make the effective price of home, the mortgage payments, a little bit higher. And then a lot of other things have grown more than wages and grown more than the official rate of inflation. And this is CPI inflation, which is not quite the measure that the Fed is shooting for, the 2%, which is the PCE inflation. So we've got real wages up about 4% more than inflation versus February of 2020, pre-recession, pre-pandemic, pre-recession.
And there is no time during the Biden era when we didn't have more purchasing power than 2019. That blue line has always grown cumulatively more than the inflation lines. It got close there in 2022, but still, you always had more purchasing power under Biden than Trump because the wages outgrew inflation.
Okay, so what we got here is the real hourly wages are higher than they were back in the pre-pandemic era. And we had, during the pandemic, what we had is 2 months where we lost 22 million jobs. And many of those jobs were low-wage jobs. And so let's say you have, in just a simple math thing, 2 people making $50 an hour, one making $25 an hour, and one making $7.25 an hour. If the person making $7.25 an hour loses their job, the average wage goes way up, even if total wages came down, and the folks who were making 50 and 25 didn't get a raise, but the average wage for everybody goes up because you're not averaging in that $7.25 wage. And that's what happened here with this big peak. And then as the low wage people got rehired, the average came back down, and now it's going back up. And this is just showing how incomes outgrew inflation 2023 versus 2019.
This one's pretty amazing in terms of how much net worth has jumped in the US. So these figures are all real, meaning they're adjusted for inflation. And it shows that from, for example, for the top 1% from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2024, you had almost a 6 trillion increase in net worth. So those people got 14% of the total increase in net worth in the US. They got about 28%. It was a 14% increase, sorry, and they got a 28% share of the increase. But their share of the net worth actually fell a little bit. And that 90th to 99th group, similar story, they're a lot richer, but their share has fallen. And that's because that bottom 90, that bottom 90% has seen their share of the wealth go up. It's still small compared to the top, but the bottom 50% has seen a big increase in those since that pre-pandemic era. The net worth for the bottom 50% went from about 2.4 trillion up to 3.8. It's a 1.4 trillion increase, or a 61% increase in net worth for that group. People became the richest ever under Biden in 2022, even adjusted for inflation. These numbers, they've come down a little bit since then, but they are still well above 2019, but we're just not quite as rich as we got in 2022. The stock market and the housing were both going up then and had peaked. Now the housing market has come back down while the stock market has continued to go up. But the bottom 50% are more sensitive to housing prices. And so that's why that group is not quite as rich as they were in 2022 when housing prices were even higher. But this is a positive sign, at least from a improving wealth inequality. But there's a long way to go. You can see that in that, I guess it's the second to last line. That's the current share of wealth held by those groups, and the bottom 50% only hold 2.5% of the wealth. That's a crazy low percentage, and that's where progressive policy of taxing the rich and helping the poor with higher minimum wages or other things can help you address that. But we've seen some nice improvements in the last 4 years or so.
So for that bottom 50% of households, you've seen the real net worth grow from 37,000. And again, a lot of this is housing into a much lesser percent stock ownership. But you see that it went from 37,000 up to 61,000, then back down to 57,000. That's what Dave was talking about. The housing prices have come down a little bit. Now, the next lowest group, the 50th percentile on up to the 90th percentile, also saw substantial growth in their net worth, fell off a little bit, and then has come back. So housing has sloughed off a little bit, but the market's sloughed off a little bit, and then the stock markets will come on strong this year.
Yeah, if you're losing sleep over the national debt, you don't have to. The top 1% have got us covered. This is the net worth in the U.S. as of the end of the second quarter of this year, and you can see the amounts of money that the different groups have, and it adds up to way more than national debt. So fears of the U.S. becoming bankrupt are greatly exaggerated.
And this is the stock market. Did well under both Biden and Trump, as a practical matter. Slightly better under Biden, but not by a lot. Okay, so somebody asked, are wages going back up now because low-wage people are losing their jobs? No, they're going back up now because people are getting raises. People are coming back getting work.
So, Karl, I've got a question for you. The other day I was reading and saw a note that BLS says that certain things are not included in the consumer price index, which we covered earlier. Things like property taxes, tips, interest charges from credit cards and from auto loans aren't factored into the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And there's some key aspects of home insurance also. Those are fairly big areas. Any sense as to why those aren't in the factor for the CPI, the inflation index?
Well, they're not really prices. I mean, how would you consider tips since many people tip in cash?
Okay.
And there was a study done a few months back and it talked about, when they're trying to explain kind of what the costs are like for people. So they put things in there like some of the things you mentioned, like interest on credit cards. Credit card interest rates have gone up, and so that's added costs that people have. So they were trying to explain inflation from sort of a cost perspective and not just a price, as Karl's mentioning. And when they threw that stuff in there, yeah, it raises the costs. But you're talking about inflation of prices, and you're comparing that to wages. If you're going to throw in a lot of other costs, what else? What should you offset that with? What other types of, are you going to talk about the net worth in the stock market going up for people? I mean, where do you draw the line? And so the way inflation has always been computed is, as Karl said, it's prices, and it's not just costs that everybody has. A lot of the financial type costs are not in there. Interest on your credit cards or mortgage interest, stuff like that is not in there. The price of housing, the price of assets like the stock market price, the housing price, that stuff's not in there. Rent is in there.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, are people getting richer? Yes or no? And Karl and I just showed you that people became the richest ever in 2022. That's net worth. That's all in. And that's what you're after, right? Are you getting richer? And yes, people are getting richer across the spectrum. We've never been richer, at least in 2022, and we're coming down a little bit from there. But still, I mean, we're incredibly prosperous right now. We were prosperous in 2019, and we're well beyond that now in 2024. That chart that we just showed, Karl, can you go back to the stock market chart for a second? I mean, toward the end of the Trump term in office, around the time Biden got elected, the stock market had fully recovered. So the stocks were up. You can see the big drop off in the red line. And then that had more or less fully recovered by the time Biden showed up. And Biden then went up 70% from there, meaning if you have an S&P 500 index fund in your 401k, and it was 100,000 at the end of the Trump administration, it's 170,000 now. I mean, it's way up, and that is just fantastic news for savers. And it's not a gimmicky number where it's like Biden was at some bottom and then it came back. I mean, the market was already at a record when this sort of started being measured, and so this is at the same point in their presidencies measured from election day. And the stock market is a leading indicator, so that's fair to do. Trump did it. It doesn't have to be from the day that Biden started. In fact, that you see that 40% jump that Biden started off with from election. Bloomberg ran an article that said that was the fastest 1 year from election ever for a president. That plus 40-ish%, 41 too, for Biden was the record fastest out of the gate from election.
Looks like Glenn has a question.
Well, I have a question about building wealth, because this actually is happening in Toledo, Ohio, where I'm from. While people are making wealth, it's where they're getting, how are they building their wealth? For example, there's a mobile home park on the north end of town who has saw their mobile lot rent jump 77% in the last 2 years. This is a 55 plus community that is basically people that are either disabled or veterans or something like that, that saw their rents lot rent go from 260 to 460. Now, that's going to be good for the LLC that owns that thing, because it looks like they're doing gangbusters, but it has really a negative effect because those people are now no longer able to afford that lot rent, and that there's a social cost that comes to it, and homelessness, and home insecurity, and then food insecurity.
Yeah, I mean, these are aggregates. So this is the bottom 50% group on average. And Karl, if you go to that net worth slide a second, go back up a couple. That bottom 50% group overall has had a very large increase in their wealth. The group you just mentioned is a subset of that, and that group would be that group would be theoretically in this average, meaning they're dragging that average down. That extra rent they're paying has probably hurt them. Most of them are probably not stock owners. They don't own their houses, probably didn't appreciate that much in value. I mean, if they're paying rent, the value of the townhome or the mobile home probably didn't go up. So they're not better off. I would say that group isn't, but they're factored into this average theoretically than most people that are just between the money that they got from Uncle Sam for all the stimulus, the wage increases, to the extent that they own some stock, or if they own housing, which a few people in this group do, they're way up. So it's just, yes, you're talking about a group that's hurting. There's other groups in this 50% that are doing extremely well.
I think that's a really good point, and I think what we need to look at as well is the percentage of increase there looks really, really good. But when you're talking about 61,000 as somebody's net worth, that is very low in terms of functioning in retirement or functioning pre-retirement. And I think that's one of the things that Trump has taken advantage of, is addressing those people. So even though we can look at this and say, well, look at how much better they've done, we need to acknowledge that the base they're coming out of is so low that it looks like it's a percentage-wise increase, yes, but it doesn't come anywhere near meeting basic needs, really.
Yeah. No, it's true. What you can say here is that people are a lot closer to meeting basic needs than they were. Meaning Trump was 2019 and Biden is 2022. Are you better off at 61 or are you better off at 36 or 37? And the answer is you're better off now. And I think that's part of the messaging that Democrats have struggled with, is to tell people how prosperous they are. And just for an example, both of you, the last two commenters, Morris and before, both said there are people that are suffering and struggling out there, and there certainly are. That doesn't change. You can't save everyone. But what you can look at are these numbers that show that we're in better shape overall than we were before. Democrats can walk and chew gum. We can say, you're better off, and here's what we're doing for people that are left behind. I'm not sure what Trump's message is to the people that are left behind that they seem to be reacting to, because you're way better off under Biden than you were under Trump. We've shown every measure that we've shown today is better now than it was. So, and not just this minute. Like, for example, the unemployment rate now is 4.1. It was 3.5 at the end of Trump's administration. But Karl, if you go back a ways to the average years for the unemployment rate, right there. I mean, Trump's best year was 3.7. And Biden had 2 years, 2022 and 2023, where he was below that. So yeah, right this minute we're at 4.0, and that's not as good as 2019. Fair enough. But throughout the 3 years of the Biden administration outside the pandemic, he was better off than Trump before the pandemic. So we need to make those distinctions as, yes, there are people that are suffering and we're going to help them. We're going to raise the minimum wage, or we're going to shore up Social Security. Trump doesn't have policies for that. He doesn't care about the minimum wage. He doesn't care about Social Security. We'll be lucky if we preserve Social Security the way under a Republican administration. Don't let the Trump propaganda fool you. We're way better off than we were because of what things that Democrats did. And you've probably seen some of the stories from the latest Economist magazine is saying how America's economy is the envy of the world. We've outgrown everybody else since the pandemic hit because of what Biden did to a large extent, that big stimulus program. So don't let that stuff discourage you. We've got the better case. It's just a question of how we make it. And we have to address the people that are left behind. But I don't see how Trump has done that. Like tariffs, for example, are a tax on the middle class. You can't save people with tariffs. Those people are going to pay a lot more. We're all going to pay a lot more for imports because of those tariffs. That is a tax. We don't want to pay that. So Trump's policies are actually going to hurt the people that he says it's going to help. And we'll show you some slides on that a little bit later. But don't believe anything about how Trump is a superior guy on the economy. I mean, that is definitely something that's out there in the polling, but it's not factual. It's not fact-based. You're way better off under the Democrat policies. And it's not close. It's not close at all.
It's like, currently the unemployment rate's 4.0, 4.1. Were we better off 4 years ago when it was 8.1? But yet Many people say, yes, we were. Anyhow, Catherine, you have a question.
No, I'd just like to point out that I think that the reason why there's this big gap between the picture that you're painting for us here and what a lot of people are feeling and experiencing is the way you have aggregated your data. When you put the bottom 50% of the population together, you're not looking granularly enough, because the people in the maybe from the 20 to the 50% are a very different group from the people in the bottom 20%. You're talking about how unemployment is down. That's great for people that can work. Doesn't help retirees. Doesn't help the elderly. So when you have folks in this bottom group who every time they go to the grocery store, they have to figure out, do they have enough money to buy basics? And their rent gets doubled or close to it. It's not just that they're hurting, it's that they are in crisis. We Democrats have to be very careful how we talk about this, because otherwise we come across as being A, ignorant, and B, just plain uncaring. Poverty is
I disagree strongly with that.
poverty. Let me
We
finish.
have
please.
to, because the
Sure,
Republicans
let me
are never penalized for that, right? Republicans are never penalized for Trump saying how
All right, you don't
awesome
want
the
me to
economy is. He got no penalty. People
I'm
think
not-
he's
I'm not
better on the
defending
economy.
Donald Trump. I'm trying to get you to understand the reality on the ground.
Well, I think that
I live
reality
in the
on the
state
ground
of
is
New
determined
Jersey.
by a
If
media
you-
narrative that you
Sure.
shouldn't
Would you let me
believe.
finish, please? I
You
live
should
in this-
believe it.
I live in the state of New Jersey. If you go to the website of the New Jersey chapter of the Poor People's Campaign, you can read a fact sheet about the poverty that is being experienced by many people in our state, which is a blue state. We have a lot of great social services. But what happened after the pandemic aid ended, there was a lot of price gouging on food. There was a lot of price gouging on rent. Gas prices spiked. They're back down now, but they were very high for quite a while. And so people that experience this feel very resentful about being told that actually you're better off than you were. So I'm just saying we have to be careful how we
Careful, I agree with, but I think we've been too quiet about it because nobody knows this stuff. The vast majority of people think the economy was better before the pandemic than it is now. And
I
for
don't agree
example, when
with
it comes
that.
to elderly,
I don't think
Eight-
that's the case.
80, well, no, I mean, that's what the data tells us, is that people think the economy was better under Trump.
Well, some
And
people that
it's
support
just not
Trump
factually
think that,
accurate.
but the rest of
About
us know better. I don't
About
think that's
80%
the
of
general
elderly
opinion.
own their homes. 80% of elderly households own their homes.
Exactly.
So
And the bottom 20% do not. And those
Right,
are the people
right.
that are
But-
hurting the most.
right, but you got 80% of the
nothing.
population that's benefiting, and you need to make sure that you talk to them and market that hey, housing prices have gone up. That's helping you, the 80% of elderly that own your homes. For those of you that
Not
are
helping
renting,
the bottom 20%. And
Right.
that's what I'm trying to get you guys to pay some attention to.
Yeah.
Just pay some attention to it,
yeah,
because it's a real problem.
yeah, okay, fair enough. I
Thank
mean,
you
we're
for
not
letting
saying
me know.
no, that there's no problem at the bottom. We're simply saying you got to
Just
understand that
please
the Democrat.
out-
Look,
check
go
out the
back up
fact
one more,
sheet.
Karl. Go to the
check out
CBO.
the fact sheets on the Poor People's Campaign.
Go down a little bit to the other way toward the CBO page, the one on the CBO that talks about all the levels. Yep, it's one or two more here. There you go. What this
I think
says
the
is
other
that
factor is that no one,
from the
absolutely
bottom,
no one, whether they're at the top or the bottom, believes they are an average. The averages are meaningless. It's what's their lived experience.
Exactly.
That is what is important.
well, it is to them. What this says is that at all levels, the lowest 20%, the next 20, the next 20, that's a quintile, fifths of the population, all were better off in 2023 than 2019. Incomes outgrew inflation across that board at every level. What CBO is saying here is that actually down is good in this chart. They're saying at every level, you could buy stuff more easily in 2023 than you could in 2019. Democrats don't talk about this. The Congressional Budget Office is the best source of information you can get. They advise the Congress and both parties. They're run by a Republican.
I agree with you, and we're not arguing with you. What we are saying is know your audience. That with different audiences, you have to take different things into account.
No, that's a fair comment. Understand that the data we're showing is broken down into groups. We're showing the bottom 20% better off in 2023 than 2019 here in terms of income. Catherine mentioned that the bottom 20% of elderly that are renting and are paying more for gas and paying more for food are hurting. I'm not disputing that, but that's the bottom 20%. The top 80% that own homes have seen significant price appreciation. So keep that in mind, is that with all this negativity, the vast majority of people are doing better than they were. And this breaks it down into the fifths of the population. I don't have it here because I've got the bottom 50% for the wealth. But there is another way of looking at that wealth that gets you down into lower levels. The bottom is doing better because of the large stimulus payments, the wage increases if you're working. And even for elderly, the COLAs are a little behind, they lag. But the cumulative COLA you've gotten since 2019 is not much different from the cumulative inflation. So it hasn't changed very much. So when I hear the negativity and about all the suffering, I just say, is it better or worse than it was in 2019? And we're saying you're better off than you were in 2019. And that is should be the key voting criteria. That's not what it is, though. There is a lot of negativity out there. And I think in many cases, Democrats buy into what they hear on the news. And that is often shaped by the Republican narrative. Be happy that a huge percent of the population is doing way better than 2019. And let's talk about then, yes, what are we doing for that bottom group? The Republicans will do nothing for them. They will make it worse. And tariffs we'll show you what the projections are for the tariffs. They're terrible in terms of the impact they're going to have on the bottom part of the population, because you make all the goods more expensive that people are buying from Walmart. Karl, do you want to start the next section?
We got here.
While Karl is looking for that next section, David, I was at a meeting today, and I was trying to make sure that everybody was a retiree, that every year we get a COLA adjustment on our Social Security. And I ran the last 4 COLA increases, and it came out to compounded to 23.5%. And yet they were arguing with me that they ever got those increases. They see the eggs, they see the gas price, but somehow they don't see the Social Security increases, and that's tough. And they get kind of argumentative at times. So
nobody likes inflation. I mean, it gets annoying because you're reminded of it every day, right? You get your COLA once a year, but you get hit every time you go to the gas station or the supermarket with the higher prices, and you don't realize, well, actually, I've been compensated for that to a large extent. And I bet you a lot of the people that you're arguing with, if they live in this area, they own their homes, they're not renters, and they are doing very well on their home prices. And if something happened and they had to extract equity, they could get it from their home if they needed to in an emergency, in ways they couldn't do back in 18 and 19. The home equity is at like a record level in the United States now. I remember seeing the headline. I didn't dig into it because I just look at the overall net worth. But the housing prices it's a tremendous benefit for the 80% of elderly and the 65% of Americans overall who own their homes. But in the media, if you look at the Washington Post, or the New York Times, it's housing crisis this, housing crisis that, and it's like, for who? For the 80% of elderly that own the homes, the 65% of Americans who own their homes. I mean, who's the crisis for? And it's for a minority of people, and they are suffering, no doubt, but they're in better shape than they were in 2019. And so part of the uphill and sort of upstream swimming that we're doing here is to say, look at how good these numbers are, even when you split them up a bit, not just the overall average, but you get down into the bottom 20%, bottom 50%, people are better off. And they just don't hear that enough. they want to hear that, they hear the negativity.
Bill, one of the things I would mention with regard to Social Security payments is those are pretty much direct deposited for most people. And so unless you're part of the 1% that actually balances your checkbook every month, you don't see it. But every time you go to the grocery store or pass by the gas stations, you see those increases in prices. And when the prices come down, you don't notice it as much. Mark Lundholm raised hand.
Yeah, I'm the treasurer of my condo association, and we're looking at our budget for next year. And the Palatine, Village of Palatine services are going up, and the insurance certainly are going up. We want to try to maintain our buildings and so on and so forth. So we want to increase our association fees some, but not too much. But it seems like you're losing ground. And I think that a lot of people are feeling like they're losing ground. Gas prices are actually down from what I've seen. I try to track it on the stock market every day. I don't understand petroleum at all. And I think there's actually a glut of petroleum. They're trying to find places to store it because there's so much petroleum. They don't know what to do with it. Now, that's not really reflected in our gas prices, but that's sort of what I'm hearing.
Yeah, gas prices are not unusual right now. They're pretty typical historically.
Yeah, it's like, so I don't understand petroleum. And if we took away their subsidies, they'd raise our prices a lot. But, I have problems with them anyway. But
in 2023, the gas prices were about 50 cents a gallon on average above where you would expect historically them to be relative to the price of oil.
Right.
That's a lot. That's in fact, 2023 had the highest, that number, that 50%, that 50 cent number was the highest difference going back to the year 2000. For the data I looked at, the gas prices were more than you would expect in 2023 than any other year. And 2022 wasn't far behind it, meaning you had really unusually high differences in gas price above what you would predict based on the history. That historical relationship of a barrel of oil price and a gallon of gas price was just off. It's come back down. It's a little bit more normal now, but it's still high. So the oil companies are having fun with us. Still.
Well, they aren't, but who was the woman that was on, why do we feel like we're losing ground? I think that's what she was saying.
Yeah. And
we feel like we're losing ground.
And a lot of it is the news. It isn't actually happening. It's just people are perceiving that because that's what they're hearing all the time. It's, if you look at the stock market, if you've got a 401k or you've got money in stocks, if you've got a house that you own, if you're earning a wage, almost every way you look at it, we're better off than we were before the pandemic. And that doesn't mean that some people aren't left behind. There aren't people that are suffering. It's that in general, the U.S. economy is much better than it was back then. Well, and I think a lot of these stories get amplified in ways that people aren't thinking about very well either. Because, for example, wages, and it's easier to do when I've got an example, but bear with me a second. Wages, when you get a wage increase, that is applied to your sort of your gross income, right? If you're making $100 and you get a 10% raise, you're making 110. But your costs, for whatever you buy, your food, your rent, whatever, for most people, the vast majority, you're using that, you're buying stuff out of your after-tax income. So it's a much smaller number. So maybe your gross income's 100 and your net income is 70 or 60 after taxes. It's that smaller number where inflation gets applied. So if you have a 10% increase in your $100 wage, you're at 110. If you have a 10% increase in your $60 cost structure, that's $6. You're still coming out ahead. So people don't understand that either, and that your cost, inflation is applied to your costs, which is a much smaller number than your income, and that's where the wages apply. So when we showed you that chart that had wages outgrowing inflation, that factor is more amplified by what I just said. So I think a lot of it is the media is telling people you're suffering, and people have a really hard time breaking out of that. They're just told that they're suffering or their neighbor is suffering. It's like, there's no way that all these people are suffering when so many are doing so well. It's almost impossible statistically. 20%, 15%, that's truly worse off now than they were in 2019.
Well, and I would like to discuss the people in the mobile home park, and I would like to say, what I would like them to be able to do would be to buy their property out from under the landowner so that they could run their own cooperative mobile home park and run it themselves. They would hopefully be better off than what they are, and the landowner's gouging them. And, I don't know what to do about that. But, then, I sort of look at Danish economic theory and Scandinavian theories that maybe help people out better. Sweden's not doing as well where my sister's living. But anyway, that's sort of my feelings on that. And I don't know what we do about that.
Vote for as many Democrats as you can.
Yes.
We missed, just think about this. Biden proposed the BBB, right? The triple B, which had a lot more generous stuff in it. And it actually passed the House, but the Senate blocked it. Sinema and Manchin, I think it was both of them. And then you had the Republicans. So we got incredibly close to getting a much more generous safety net than we had. And it was only a handful more Democrats that we needed to get it. And so a lot of people seem to punish the Democrats when we don't get stuff done. Like Biden has struggled to get the student loan forgiveness cleanly done. He does all these programs, but then the Supreme Court reverses it or courts reverse it. And it's unclear. You have to kind of parse through the data to see how much ground he really made. What was he able to really get rid of and for how many people? It's hard to figure that out. You have to really search for it. That wouldn't have happened if we had passed a law to do that. A law would have allowed us to do it. It would have essentially, the Congress would have funded it. The Supreme Court would not have overturned it. So to get that done, which would have, you're looking at 40,000 up 20 to 40,000 per household for for 40 million households that had student loan debt. That's a giant improvement. And we just missed it by a couple of Democrats. So that's why we got to make sure we're selling along with the sympathy. I hear the point. It's fair enough. But we got to sell. People need to know that the economy is better, and then we can say, okay, but we're going to help those that are left behind by doing X, Y, and Z. And that second part gets lost if we don't get to the first part. All right. Let's see. I think should we take a break, a 10-minute break or so, and then come back about 8:10?